How do we define emotional or behavioral disorders? Well, defining emotional and behavioral disorders presents a difficult challenge. Mental health and normal behavior are hard to define in the first place. Professional groups and experts have felt the freedom to construct their own working definitions to fit their professional purposes. Also, no one has come up with a definition that all professionals understand and accept. Assumptions or theories about why people behave as they do and then what we should do about it offers conflicting ideas about what the problem actually is. There is a general agreement that emotional and behavioral disorders refers to. One is that the behavior goes to an extreme. It's not just slightly different from the usual behaviors. Next, the problem is chronic. It's one that does not quickly disappear. And lastly, the behavior is unacceptable because of social and cultural expectations. There is a federal definition. The federal rules governing the implementation of IDEA define the term emotionally disturbed as a condition over a long period of time and to a marked extent which adversely affects educational performance. This list consists an inability to learn, an inability to establish satisfactory relationships with peers and teachers, inappropriate types of behaviors, pervasive moods of unhappiness and depression, tendencies to develop physical symptoms or fears associated with personal or school problems. The term emotionally disturbed also includes children who are schizophrenic, but the term does not include children who are socially maladjusted unless it is determined that they are emotionally disturbed. There is an alternative definition to the federal definition, and the alternative definition is by the National Mental Health and Special Education Coalition. This definition emphasizes that comparisons must be made to other children of the same age, and that the cultural and ethnic norms must be taken into consideration. There are multiple advantages of the alternative definition versus the federal definition. The alternative definition is more inclusive and explicit than the federal definition. For example, it uses terminology that reflects current professional preferences. The alternative definition includes both disorders of emotions and behavior and that they could occur separately or in combination. It's school-centered, but it doesn't ignore that disorders exhibited outside the school are just as important. The alternative definition doesn't include mild or transient problems or ordinary responses to stress. It's sensitive to cultural and ethnic backgrounds. It acknowledges the importance of trial interventions. The alternative definition recognizes that students can have multiple disabilities, and it includes a full range of emotional or behavioral disorders that are of concern to mental health. Now I'm going to be talking about some examples of emotional and behavioral disorders. The first example I have is the anxiety disorders. This is an umbrella term that refers to several distinct disabilities that share the core characteristic of irrational fear. Some of these disabilities include generalized anxiety disorder, obsessive-compulsive disorder, panic disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and social anxiety disorders. The next disorder is called bipolar disorder, and this is a mental illness that causes extreme mood swings from overly high to sad and hopeless, and then back again, overly high to sad and hopeless. It's a vicious cycle of moods. The bipolar disorder also has severe changes in energy and behavior that go along with these mood swings. Continuing on with the emotional and behavioral disorders, another example is depression. Depression is a condition in which a person persistently feels discouraged, sadness, hopelessness, unmotivated, or disinterested in life itself. Another disorder that is commonly seen throughout grade school classrooms and junior high is conduct disorder. This refers to a group of behavioral and emotional problems in young children and adolescents. They typically have a hard time following the rules and behaving in a socially acceptable way. This may include some of the following behaviors: aggression to people and animals, destruction of property, deceitfulness, lying or stealing, or truancy or other serious violations of rules. Lastly, I have listed the psychotic disorders. This is a term, another umbrella term, that is used to refer to severe mental disorders that cause abnormal thinking and perceptions, such as hallucinations, and schizophrenia would fall under this disorder. The last topic I will be discussing with you is the identification of students with emotional or behavioral disorders. Students with emotional or behavioral disorders don't go unnoticed by the teachers. Although the younger the child, the more difficult it is to identify them with an emotional or behavioral disorder, and this is because it's more difficult to judge whether their behavior signifies a serious problem or not. Typically, in schools, the most common type of emotional or behavioral disorder is the conduct disorder, which I had mentioned previously. The conduct disorder is an externalizing problem that attracts immediate attention, so identifying a child with this disorder is rarely a problem. On the other hand, students with internalizing disorders are less obvious, but they aren't difficult to recognize. There are also rarely problems when identifying children with schizophrenia, although at first they might first be identified with a different disorder such as ADHD or depression, and this is because the symptoms of schizophrenia aren't necessarily more obvious as they would be as the child gets older, so typically they are identified with a different disorder before schizophrenia. An important note is that teachers are more inclined to notice an emotional or behavioral disorder if they are sensitive to the children's problems. So, as a teacher, it's super important that we are aware and unbiased and sensitive to all of our students and their behaviors. That way we can identify an emotional or behavioral disorder when we see them. It's important to know as future teachers that some students don't show symptoms of emotional or behavioral disorders at school. Also, there aren't many services for students with emotional and behavioral disorders. Therefore, there isn't necessarily a screening process for the children because there aren't services available to treat them. But in general, a teacher's informal judgment and identification have served as a reasonably valid and reliable means of screening students for emotional behavioral disorders. So it's super important that as future teachers, we know how to identify these students. We should constantly be aware and intuitive to how students respond. And from there, we can take the next step in identifying these students and getting them the help they need.
Now let us discuss the reasons why a child may develop an emotional or behavioral disorder. There are 4 major influences on the development of emotional and behavioral disorders. The first are biological factors. The second is the family environment. Third is the cultural environment. And finally, we're going to discuss the school environment. Biological factors, genes. There is evidence that genetic inheritance plays a role in the development of mental, emotional, and behavioral disorders. Twin studies and studies of families indicate that EBD can run in families. As yet, no single gene has been identified as causing emotional and behavioral disorders. The working theory is that a host of genes have an effect on how we respond to the stressors in our life, and that the environment we live in can upregulate or downregulate the transcription of these genes, leading to the development of emotional and behavior disorder. Biological factors, gender. Sex hormones and genes encoded on sex chromosomes affect how our brains develop and process the information received from the environment. Boys and girls' cognitive, emotional, and behavioral development differs. On average, boys are more likely to be more physically active, tolerate frustration poorly, and be more aggressive, impulsive, and have dysregulated emotions. On average, girls develop language, empathetic, and social skills earlier, and have higher rates of fearfulness and anxiety. With any conversation about gender differences, it is important to note these differences aren't absolute. Individuals of either sex can be affected by any of these issues. Biological factors, life experiences. Any experience that results in damage to the brain or biological functioning can lead to the development of emotional and behavioral disorders. This includes, but is not limited to, malnutrition, disease, and brain trauma, such as concussions. Family environment. As with the other causes I've discussed here, family environment is but one part of the whole. It is never okay for a teacher to blame a parent for their child's EDD, because even the best parents can have children who deal with emotional and behavioral disorders, and it is not our job to seek someone to blame for a student's problems. That being said, here are some family environments that are considered risk factors for developing EDD. Poverty, single-family households, divorce, conflict in the family, abuse, poor parental attachment, and parents who deal with mental, emotional, or behavioral disorders themselves. Social environment. One of the biggest social environmental factors in the development of EDD is socioeconomic status. Poverty comes with a host of biological, familial, and social stresses. They include malnutrition, parents who are working multiple jobs and are not in the house, uncertainty about housing, and living in a setting that exposes children to drugs, violence, and mostly pollution. Other cultural influences can include the level of violence in the media, fear of national threats such as terrorism and war, a demand of high academic performance, religious demands and restrictions on behavior, and changing standards for sexual behavior. School environment. There are a number of things in the school setting which can influence the development of emotional and behavioral disorders. Teacher interactions. Students who begin school with EDD can experience a spiral of negative interactions with the adults they encounter at school. Children who exhibit disorders when they enter school may become better or worse according to the way they are managed in the classroom. Peer interactions. Negative experiences with other students, such as bullying. Academic performance. A student's poor academic performance can contribute to the development or worsening of emotional and behavioral disorders. Next, we're going to talk about the characteristics of students with emotional and behavioral disorders. That includes their intelligence and academic performance and their social emotional characteristics. Intelligence and achievement. While students who deal with emotional and behavioral disorders can run the gamut from those with intellectual disabilities to those who are considered gifted, research demonstrates that most pupils with EBD score low average on intelligence tests. Students with EBD have the highest dropout rate among all individuals with disabilities, with almost half of students with EBD leaving school before graduation. Social and emotional characteristics. Externalizing. Aggressive acting out behavior, such as arguing, impulsiveness, fighting, noncompliance. Under controlled behaviors. Normal children cry, scream, fight, and argue too, but not with the impulsivity or frequency as students dealing with EBD. Conduct disorder is the most common externalizing form of EBD. It is the number one reason that students are referred to professionals. Students who externalize their emotional or behavioral disorders are very frequently unpopular with their peers. Aggression. Researchers' findings indicate that aggression is a learned behavior. Students see parents, siblings, friends, and even characters in the media model aggressive behavior and imitate them. This is especially true if the aggressive behavior is modeled by someone the child perceives as high status and then receives rewards or escapes punishment for their behavior. It is important to teach aggressive students a different way of interacting with the world because aggressive behaviors extend into adulthood. Internalizing. The most prevalent internalizing behaviors are depression, anxiety, social withdrawal, and physical complaints. Students usually suffer in silence. If students do not learn social skills as children, the isolation and anxiety can extend into adulthood and make adjusting and coping with everyday pressures difficult. Depression. Depression is persistent, pervasive feelings of sadness, hopelessness, and unworthiness. What can depression look like in children? Well, it can manifest itself in a number of different ways. It could be irritability, sadness, lethargy, weight gain or loss, sleep disturbances, bedwetting or enuresis, fecal soiling or encopresis, increased defiance, or impaired concentration. When depression is recognized early, treatment can lead to significant improvements in a student's mood and ability to function in life. Depression in adolescence. Some statistics. 14 is the average age of onset of major depressive episodes. 12.5% of 12 to 17-year-olds will experience a major depression. Adolescents with major depressive episodes have substance abuse rates that are twice their peers. Finally, it is important to note that suicide is the leading cause of death among 12 to 24-year-olds. As teachers, we can have a direct impact on a student's recovery. Simply having someone with whom to build a close relationship can be an important tool with helping students cope with depression.
Educational considerations. Students with emotional or behavioral disorders tend to have low grades and higher dropout rates. The national agenda was written, but is very vague, which makes it difficult to use as a guide. Special educators have yet to reach a consensus about how to educate students with emotional or behavioral disorders. Teaching models for educating students with emotional or behavioral disorders have two main objectives. The first, controlling misbehavior. The second, teaching students the academic and social skills they need. Balancing behavior control with academic and social learning. Behavioral control strategies are an essential part of educational programs for students with EBD. They are necessary to control disruptive behavior so that academic and social learning can still occur. Even the best instructional programs won't eliminate the poor behavior completely. Teachers with students who have emotional or behavioral disorders must have very effective control strategies as well as excellent classroom management. Integrated services. Children with emotional or behavioral disorders typically have home issues and difficulties within the community. These issues and difficulties could range from illegal activities that they partake in, any sort of substance abuse, and if they're older, perhaps in high school, difficulty finding and maintaining a job. Psychiatry, psychotherapy, or counseling might be needed for students with emotional or behavioral disorders. However, not one thing will help. Integrating these services will be most effective. So what works? There are strategies out there that work. They are systematic and data-based interventions. They are continuous assessment and progress monitoring, which is direct daily assessment of skills. So the progress monitoring, like the teacher is just always on top of it, assessing what's going on. Practice of new skills, so modeling after a potential classmate, rehearsal, so practicing, and guided practice. Treatment matched to problems, multi-component treatment where teachers use different interventions to meet multiple needs, and programming for transfer and maintenance. This is interventions that promote transfer of learning to new situations. And lastly, sustained intervention. This is emotional or behavioral disorders demand lifelong support. So it's something that they have developed and it's not going away. Service delivery. So only a small percentage of children with emotional or behavioral disorders are officially identified and receive the help that they need. So there are trends towards inclusion. So no matter the severity of the EBD of the student will more often than not be placed in a regular, general, class whenever possible. And integrating students with emotional behavioral disorder requires intensive work and can be very difficult. So placement. Different needs require different placements. And the placement for students with emotional or behavioral disorder is particularly tough. However, it's important to keep in mind to make placement decisions, you gotta take it case by case. So, instructional considerations. Students with an emotional or behavioral disorder need more than their peers as models to follow instruction correctly, meaning they can't just be placed in a general classroom and expected to look around and model the behavior that they see. They need direct instruction, and this is often why special classes are considered as a placement for a student with an emotional or behavioral disorder, because those classes offer more direct instruction, more one-on-one time, and they're typically smaller classes. So the need for social skills. Most students with an emotional or behavioral disorder require specific instruction for not only academic skills, but social skills as well. So effective methods are needed for basic academic skills and basic social skills. Social skills and effective experiences are as crucial as academic skills. So having good interactions with classmates and their teacher and learning how to effectively communicate is just as important as learning how to handle everyday classroom activities. Needs of juvenile delinquents. So, educational programs for extremely troubled youths vary among states and localities. Sometimes special classes or schools are provided for students with an aggressive history. Incarcerated children rarely receive proper education, and this is because there is a lack of resources, poor cooperation among agencies, and the attitude in the society that delinquents are not entitled to the same opportunities as law-abiding citizens. Special challenges for teachers. So this one's quite obvious. Teachers who teach students with an emotional or behavioral disorder need to be very tolerant and ready to handle any disruption in the classroom. They also need to be very patient, but along the lines of the disruption, that requires, like I said earlier, very consistent and very strong classroom management. So, assessment of progress. Ongoing assessment of students with an emotional or behavioral disorder should include measures that address social emotional behavior that influences a number of things. First, obviously, academic learning, like how are they doing in the classroom? Second, interpersonal skills. What are their social skills like? Have they been making friends? Have they been, being polite? And study skills, motivation, and engagement. Are they paying attention in class? Getting excited about an assignment, etc. So with that ongoing assessment, teachers tend to use rating scales and direct observation to monitor students' progress in behavior and social skills. Multiple tests of academic achievement are also made available. Often, however, monitoring academic progress tends to be neglected because of the higher concern for these students' behavior success. So, early intervention. Early identification and intervention are the best steps towards helping a student with an emotional or behavioral disorder. Younger children's social emotional behavior is very flexible, so early intervention can have lasting effects and be very successful. It is a tough disorder to identify, however, because oftentimes children are seen to have challenging behavior anyways.